Jaylen Reed stood frozen in front of the whiteboard, the answer still fresh on his lips. Perfect, precise, undeniable. But instead of praise, the teacher laughed. "That's janitor math," Mr. Fletcher sneered, turning to the class. Phones came out. Laughter erupted. His father cleaned this school. Now they were erasing his son in broad daylight. What happened next made the whole country choose a side. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In Barton Hollow, the trees stood tall, the lawns stayed trimmed, and the smiles were wide but shallow. It was the kind of place where silence was more common than sincerity, where tradition was mistaken for virtue, and where conformity was expected at every level. Jaylen Reed stepped into Crestfall High with his heart thudding in sync with each footstep. His shoes weren't new, his backpack had a faded patch on the side, and his sweatshirt bore the kind of minor stains that spoke of life, not laziness. But it wasn't his appearance that drew the looks. It was his last name. Jaylen knew the hallways long before his first day. He had walked them every summer, helping his father sweep up after graduation parties and scrape gum from under desks. Maurice Reed had worked at Crestfall for nearly 12 years. The janitor's cart was his badge, the squeaky wheels a metronome of his invisible labor. Maurice was reliable, always early, always quiet, always overlooked. Except by Jaylen. To Jaylen, every streak-free window and freshly waxed floor was a testament to a man who refused to let the world define his worth. But Barton Hollow didn't see dignity in work. It saw rank, it saw hierarchy, and janitors belonged at the bottom. On the first day of school, Jaylen felt that hierarchy close in on him, like a net. He noticed the pause in a teacher's voice when they read his last name during roll call. He caught the smirk on a girl's face when she whispered something behind her hand, and most of all, he saw the way Mr. Fletcher looked at him. Mr. Fletcher was the kind of teacher that exuded authority with every calculated gesture. His pressed shirts and outdated blazers gave him the look of someone who never left the 1980s. His classroom was pristine, his rules unforgiving, and his tone laced with superiority. He taught calculus not as a subject but as a gatekeeping ritual, a test of who belonged and who didn't. Jaylen took his seat in the middle row, notebook open, pencil poised. He loved math. It wasn't just numbers to him, it was balance. A world of right answers, of patterns, of logic, that didn't care where your father worked, or what shoes you wore. But Mr. Fletcher didn't see it that way. Midway through the class, Mr. Fletcher turned to the whiteboard and scribbled a problem that most college freshmen would hesitate to solve. It sprawled across the board like a dare: complex integrals, multiple variables, and just enough trapdoors to humiliate the unprepared. "Let's see," Mr. Fletcher said without turning. His voice clipped. "Jaylen Reed, why don't you take a shot at this one?" There was a beat of silence. Jaylen looked up, startled. His pencil trembled slightly in his grip. The room shifted, eyes narrowing in his direction. He wasn't the only black student in the room, but he was the only one being tested in this way. A few students exchanged amused glances. One boy pulled out his phone, pretending to stretch but aiming the camera just enough. Jaylen stood, slowly, and approached the board. His heart pounded, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he knew what this was. This wasn't about calculus. It was about lineage. It was about proving that someone like him didn't belong in advanced math. He picked up the marker and started writing. Line by line, Jaylen solved the equation. His breathing steadied as the numbers aligned. The integrals melted down, and the final answer emerged crisp and correct. He underlined it and stepped back. Silence. Mr. Fletcher stared at the board, then back at Jaylen. "Interesting," he muttered, then louder, for the class to hear. "Looks like janitorial work might involve more math than I thought." Laughter, sharp and scattered. Jaylen felt it like glass in his skin. He clenched his fists at his side, but said nothing. Fletcher continued. "A janitor's son solving integrals? Let's see how long that lasts." And just like that, Jaylen's answer was erased. Not from the board, but from their respect. It wasn't about being right. It was about being put back in his place. Jaylen returned to his seat, his eyes burning. Around him, murmurs floated through the air. A few sympathetic eyes met his, but most avoided contact. Mr. Fletcher began a lecture on logarithmic derivatives, as if nothing had happened, but Jaylen couldn't hear any of it. All he could hear was the echo of that sneer. and the unspoken promise that humiliation had only just begun. Mr. Fletcher leaned in and sneered. A janitor's son solving integrals. Let's see how long that lasts. The morning sun filtered through the cracked blinds of room 208, casting long shadows across the desks. It was a new day for most students, but for Jaylen Reed it felt like a trap waiting to be sprung. He walked into Mr. Fletcher's calculus class with his backpack pressed tightly to his side, his head slightly bowed, and the memory of yesterday's humiliation still burning in his chest. There were whispers again. Faint, sharp-edged, designed to hurt without being heard, by authority. Some students gave him a quick glance. Others didn't bother hiding their smirks. Jaylen knew his name had spread. The story wasn't about how he solved the problem. It was about how he was put in his place afterward. He could feel the difference in the air, a shift from curiosity to resentment, admiration curdling into mockery. Mr. Fletcher entered the room with the same smug composure he always wore. But something about his posture was different. It wasn't just authority, it was anticipation. Like a hunter entering a clearing, knowing the prey had no exit. He turned his back to the class and began writing a new problem on the whiteboard. This time, it wasn't just difficult. It was practically sadistic, a triple integral with a region bounded by obscure surfaces, followed by a transformation that required spatial intuition most students hadn't yet developed. It was a problem designed not to teach, but to break confidence. Jaylen watched the symbols take form. He knew this wasn't part of the standard curriculum. It was deliberately chosen, and before the teacher even turned around, Jaylen knew who it was meant for. When Mr. Fletcher gestured toward the board with a slow, calculated movement, the room fell into a hush. Jaylen's name wasn't even spoken. It didn't need to be. The gesture was enough. The expectation in the air was suffocating. Jaylen rose from his seat, slower this time. The weight wasn't just on his shoulders. It had spread to his limbs, his breath the soles of his shoes. He walked to the board, under the pressure of 50 eyes, each one waiting, hoping, some even daring him to fail. He stared at the equation for a long moment, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did, and that's what terrified him. He could solve it, but he already knew that wouldn't be enough. With careful deliberation, he began to write. His handwriting was clean, the steps precise. He factored, transformed, substituted, simplified. The room was silent, except for the occasional scuff of a shoe or click of a pen. A few students had pulled out their phones again, pretending to take notes while quietly recording. Jaylen reached the final line. His answer was correct. Perfect, in fact. But as he stepped away, leaving the full solution in black marker for the room to see, there was no applause, no recognition, only silence. Mr. Fletcher approached the board slowly, hands clasped behind his back. He examined the solution with the cold precision of a scientist dissecting something he didn't respect. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he pointed out a pronunciation error Jaylen had made earlier during class discussion. Not about the math, but about how he'd said coefficient, instead of constant, in a previous explanation. It was unrelated, irrelevant, but it became the focus. He remarked on Jaylen's creative logic, a term that dripped with condescension. He said the steps were surprisingly decent for someone with limited academic influence at home. Then came the word that landed like a slap. Janitor math. A sharp laugh burst from somewhere in the back. Then another, and another. Soon the laughter rolled through the classroom like a wave, not loud enough to be punished, but cruel enough to wound. Jaylen didn't move. He stood at the board, staring not at his solution, but at the rows of faces, some entertained, others indifferent. No one said a word in his defense. Someone's phone buzzed. A camera lens tilted. His humiliation was now documented, ready for upload, replay, and ridicule. The term janitor math spread like wildfire before the day was over. By lunchtime, the video was already on Instagram, clipped and captioned. It showed Jaylen solving the problem, followed by a shaky pan to Mr. Fletcher's smirk, and the sarcastic comment. The sound of laughter became the background track. The hashtag appeared almost instantly, janitor genius. But it wasn't admiration. It was mockery packaged as irony. Jaylen became a meme. He sat in the cafeteria, alone at a corner table, as students scrolled through their phones just loudly enough for him to hear his own name. Some laughed. Others watched silently. The worst were the ones who looked at him with pity. They didn't see his talent anymore. They saw tragedy. Maurice Reed arrived that afternoon to begin his shift. He passed by room 208, his cart squeaking slightly, as he moved down the hall. He didn't know what had happened yet, but he sensed it in the way students looked at him. Less like he was invisible, and more like he was the punchline. One even dropped a paper cup near his cart, made eye contact, and walked away laughing. That evening Jaylen didn't speak much. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands balled into fists, staring at the wood grain as if it might offer an escape. Maurice sat across from him with a gentle presence, but his silence carried its own weight. The unspoken truth between them was thicker than the quiet. Jaylen had faced something Maurice had tried his whole life to protect him from, and he knew now it wasn't something elbow grease or hard work could clean away. By the next day, teachers had started to hear about the video. Some chuckled in passing, others avoided eye contact. No one addressed it officially. The school had seen many things go viral, but this was different. This was internal. Embarrassment dressed as a teachable moment, and no one wanted to be the one to acknowledge what had really happened. Jaylen walked to his locker in silence, but found a note tucked inside. No name, just a folded sheet of lined paper, slightly crumpled at the edges. It read, "Stay in your place, janitor boy." The words weren't a surprise. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was not. Jaylen folded it carefully, not out of fear but defiance. He placed it in his notebook like a document for the future. Proof that what was happening wasn't imagined. It was calculated. In the teacher's lounge that afternoon, Mr. Fletcher poured himself a cup of coffee and leaned over the counter, glancing around to make sure the room was mostly empty. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through something, and smiled slightly. Then he made a call. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but the words were unmistakable. He said, "We need to talk about Jaylen Reed." In the teacher's lounge, Mr. Fletcher made a call to the school board, whispering, "We need to talk about Jaylen Reed." By nightfall, the clip of Jaylen standing humiliated at the whiteboard had already bounced between private student group chats and public TikTok pages. The classroom's fluorescent lighting, the shaky zoom on his face, the teacher's mocking tone, every second played like a scene from a satire. But this wasn't fiction, it was real, and it hurt more with every view. What began as a cruel joke among classmates spiraled into a cultural fault line for the town. The video's caption, "Janitor Math 101, spread across platforms like spilled ink, staining reputations and revealing truths that had long gone unspoken. The hashtag #JanJanitorGenius trended by midnight. But the tone was a confusing mix. Some used it sarcastically, others sincerely. Some mocked Jaylen's father's profession, others championed Jaylen's intellect. Crestfall had never been forced to look at itself before. Now it was being held up like a mirror, ugly, flawed, and national. Jaylen sat in his room that night staring at his phone screen, watching his own humiliation on loop. He felt detached, like it was happening to someone else. But the pain was his. Every view, every share, every emoji-laced comment chipped away at his sense of control. The classroom had become a stage, and he had been cast as both joke and villain. Maurice stood outside the bedroom door, not sure whether to knock or walk away. He had seen the clip too on his coworker's phone, then again from a cashier, who snickered while whispering to another. He didn't have the language for what he felt. It wasn't just anger. It was deeper, older. It was the feeling of being stripped of dignity one generation after another. By morning the town was in uproar. At Jasper's Deli, voices clashed over bagels and black coffee. Some customers blamed Jaylen, calling him entitled and sensitive. They said Mr. Fletcher was just teaching hard truths. Others were furious, especially younger black parents, who knew the quiet racism of Barton Hollow all too well. They spoke of years of subtle discipline gaps, of their children being called disruptive for raising valid questions, of PTA meetings where their voices never made it past the agenda. The school switchboard jammed by noon. Calls came in waves, some demanding Fletcher be fired, others threatening to pull their children if he was punished. One message simply said, "He was only putting that boy in his place. What's the problem?" The local paper's headline added fuel to the blaze. "Janitor's son outshines teacher. Is Crestfall divided?" The accompanying image was grainy but powerful. Jaylen's face mid-expression, caught between pride and humiliation, juxtaposed against Fletcher's icy stare. The article tried to remain neutral, but the message was clear. This wasn't just a student versus teacher issue. It was class versus class, race versus respectability, silence versus exposure. Jaylen walked the halls that day with his head low and fists clenched. Some students gave him knowing nods, subtle signs of solidarity. Others scoffed loudly as he passed, making sure he heard. A few watched him with curiosity, as if he had become more spectacle than person. The teachers were worse. Most avoided him altogether. A few offered tight performative smiles. But the rest? They watched with guarded expressions, their neutrality a clear message. We don't want trouble. In the staff lounge, Fletcher sat reclined, sipping coffee, unconcerned. He knew how this town worked. He'd taught here for 25 years. He had connections, tenure, and the unspoken approval of the PTA's wealthiest parents. He wasn't worried. Not really. The backlash would blow over. It always did. What Fletcher didn't count on was the way the story had already left Barton Hollow. A small-time education activist account picked up the video. Then a regional reporter asked for an interview. Then came a national Instagram page focused on systemic inequality in schools. Suddenly, Jaylen Reed wasn't just a student. He was a symbol. Jaylen didn't want that role. He wanted privacy, normalcy, peace. But none of those things were options anymore. By the end of the week, the school board called an emergency meeting to address the incident. It was closed door, strictly confidential. But rumors swirled faster than facts. Some claimed Fletcher was on his way out. Others said Jaylen would be moved for his own safety. The tension rippled through the town like electricity under wet pavement. Quiet, deadly, ready to explode. Maurice watched it all unfold with increasing anxiety. He had worked too long and too hard for things to fall apart now. When he and Jaylen sat together in the kitchen again, it wasn't like before. There was a distance, not between father and son, but between who they were and the life they had tried to build. Maurice warned Jaylen to be careful, not out of fear but out of knowing. This town punished ambition in black skin when it didn't stay silent. What neither of them saw coming was the response from the Crestfall Parents Coalition, a loose but loud group of affluent white families who believed the culture of discipline was under attack. They released a statement to the school board defending Fletcher as an upstanding educator who holds students accountable in a time when mediocrity is rewarded. Their statement didn't mention Jaylen by name, but it didn't have to. The next day, Jaylen and Maurice faced stares. Not just at school, but everywhere. At the gas station, a man took longer than necessary to hand back change, glaring at Maurice's uniform. At the grocery store, a woman bumped Jaylen's cart and offered a tight, insincere apology before muttering something under her breath. In the parking lot, a flyer had been stuffed under their windshield wipers. It read, "Respect teachers. Keep trouble at home." Still, Jaylen kept going to school. He entered room 28 each day knowing he wasn't welcome, but refusing to leave. Mr. Fletcher, now forced to follow stricter guidelines, didn't target him openly anymore, but his silence spoke louder. Assignments were returned late. Questions went unanswered. Praise was redirected elsewhere. Jaylen sat through each class like a soldier in enemy territory, not waiting to win, just surviving. Then came the twist. One afternoon, Jaylen opened his locker and found something unfamiliar. Not another flyer, not a cruel note. This time, it was a formal envelope, thick paper, embossed seal. It was from the Barton Hollow Foundation for Academic Excellence. Inside was a letter. It stated that due to recent attention and performance, Jaylen Reed was under review for a merit-based academic spotlight, an award typically reserved for students from legacy families or local donors. It sounded like praise, but something about the language felt off, performative, like he was being used to clean up the school's image. When Maurice read the letter, his face darkened. He had seen this before in factories, in offices, in committee meetings. The moment when institutions offered recognition, not out of belief, but self-preservation. The award wasn't a reward. It was a muzzle. Jaylen knew it too. He thanked them publicly, but privately, he made a decision. He would not let them rewrite his narrative. But even as he took control of his story, a new thread emerged. That same day, he opened his locker to find another note. Different handwriting, rougher edges, sharper words. "Stay in your place, janitor boy." No name, no signature, just the same message. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a promise. Jaylen received an anonymous note in his locker. "Stay in your place, janitor boy." The hallways of Crestfall High no longer felt like a school. They felt like a trap disguised in fluorescent lights and tiled floors. Every bell that rang sounded sharper, every footstep heavier. Jaylen Reed had stopped making eye contact, not out of fear, But fatigue, even silence he had learned, had weight, and now, it pressed on his back every moment he walked between classrooms. After the second anonymous note, his body became hyper-aware. Every hallway glance, every chuckle behind his back, every group that suddenly stopped talking as he passed, none of it went unnoticed. Jaylen adjusted the straps of his backpack tighter each morning, as if bracing himself physically for the emotional bruises waiting to be delivered between periods. Once, his locker had been untouched. Now it spoke for everyone who didn't have the courage to say it aloud. Black spray paint bled across the metal. "Clean this up, like your daddy." He stood in front of it for a long moment, unmoving. The letters weren't just offensive, they were deliberate. The insult was surgical. And the worst part? No teacher said a word. The locker sat untouched until Maurice quietly cleaned it himself after hours. Eyes lowered, mouth set in the kind of quiet rage only a father knows. Jaylen's friendships, once easy and natural, began to dissolve like paper left out in the rain. Friends who used to laugh with him now offered distant nods. Others crossed hallways early to avoid being seen at his side. One of them, Terrence, had once eaten dinner at the Reed house, even calling Maurice Uncle Mo. Now he barely raised a hand in greeting. It wasn't that they had changed. It was that fear had exposed who they had always been. Jaylen moved through the school like a ghost of his former self. The version that raised his hand eagerly in class was gone. The one who used to explain math to classmates after school had disappeared. In his place was a boy who measured each step, each word, each breath. Yet the cruelty didn't fade. One day his locker jammed. When he finally forced it open, a cascade of white dust poured out, cleaning powder, the kind his father used in restrooms. On top sat a broken broom handle, snapped jaggedly in two. It was a message, not just to Jaylen, to his father. That night, Maurice arrived early for the night shift, only to find the gym door ajar. He walked cautiously inside, pushing his cart forward. The silence was thicker than usual. The light flickered in the corner near the bleachers. He approached the equipment closet, his usual starting point, only to stop cold. The mop buckets had been slashed open. Plastic shards littered the floor. The words "quit" were sprayed in red across the back wall, dripping, uneven, fresh. Maurice stood there for a long time, unmoving. He didn't call for help. He didn't take out his phone. Instead, he bent slowly, picking up each piece of the broken buckets with a methodical quiet. His hands moved with the steadiness of someone who had cleaned up far worse messes, just never one so personal. When Jaylen found out later that night, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat on the edge of his bed, his legs motionless, his hands gripped so tightly they trembled. The rage that rose in him had nowhere to go. His mother had once told him, back when he was 7 and afraid of speaking up in class, that silence is survival. Back then it made sense. They lived in a town where the cost of being loud, black, and correct was too high. But now, silence felt like surrender. Jaylen stopped going to the cafeteria. He started taking the long route to his classes, avoiding the main staircases, the senior hall, the benches near the vending machines. Every corner of the school had become a minefield. He kept his head down, but even that wasn't protection. The whispers followed him. "Think he's gonna cry again? His dad probably wrote his homework. He thinks he's a genius. He's just janitor smart." He heard it all. And still, he said nothing. The school board remained quiet. The principal avoided eye contact in the hallway. Mr. Fletcher resumed teaching like nothing had happened. His tone was cold, professional, distant, but never remorseful. Jaylen wasn't acknowledged in class, not even when his hand went up. His name was skipped during reviews. Questions were redirected. Praise was withheld. Room 208 had become a silent battleground. Maurice considered quitting. He didn't say it aloud, but Jaylen saw it in the way his father lingered at the kitchen sink longer each night, the way his shoulders sagged lower, the way he scrubbed the same spot on his uniform over and over. But quitting would mean giving them what they wanted. Then came the twist. One rainy Thursday afternoon, as Jaylen trudged to his next class, avoiding the main corridor, a figure stood outside room 28. She wasn't familiar. She held a stack of folders in one hand, a large canvas tote on her shoulder. Her afro was pulled back into a tight bun, her expression unreadable but alert. She wore deep green slacks and a blazer that said she wasn't here to blend in. Jaylen slowed. The woman stepped into the room and introduced herself to the class. Jaylen heard murmurs. Something about Mr. Fletcher being out for personal leave. A vague explanation. No details. But Jaylen knew better. The timing was too sharp, too exact. Something had happened. She wrote her name on the board with firm, deliberate strokes. Ms. Elaine Prescott. Jaylen took his seat cautiously. He wasn't sure what to expect. The class was tense, watching her with the same skepticism they had for every outsider. But Miss Prescott didn't shrink under it. She carried herself like someone who had walked into tougher rooms and left them changed. She didn't mention the incident. Not on day one. She didn't call on Jaylen directly. She simply taught clearly, confidently, with an ease that reminded him of what learning used to feel like. Safe, neutral, balanced. But Jaylen noticed things. She lingered slightly when passing his desk, just enough to leave a folded note. He waited until the class ended to read it. It said only 5 words. I see what they did. Jaylen folded it carefully, just like he had done with the others. But this one he placed in his front pocket, not hidden. It wasn't a warning. It was the first real acknowledgement. That night Maurice asked about his day, as usual. Jaylen hesitated. Then, for the first time in weeks, he said something hopeful. There's someone new. She's different. Maurice didn't ask for details. He just nodded slowly, quietly relieved to see the flicker of light in his son's voice. But change, Jaylen knew, didn't come without cost. He returned to school the next day to find another message, this time scratched into the wooden frame of his desk. She can't save you. The threat wasn't subtle anymore. It was spread. A new teacher stepped into Jaylen's life and challenged everything. Crestfall High hadn't seen many teachers like Miss Elaine Prescott. Her first week was marked by more than just sharp lesson plans and precise control of her classroom. She didn't flinch under side eyes from staff or pretend not to hear the low-brewed tension among students. She walked the halls like someone who'd studied the terrain before entering. Not like a guest, but like someone who had returned to settle an old score. To Jaylen, she was an anomaly. She didn't try to connect in the way teachers often forced. She didn't lower her voice when talking about race. She didn't blink when students brought up coded language, or shrugged when questions turned uncomfortable. She taught history like it was a battlefield. Not just dates and names, but consequences, power, resistance, erasure. And Jaylen noticed something else. Mrs. Prescott never sat in the staff lounge. Instead, she ate her lunch in the old library archives, or outside beneath the dead sycamore near the gym. Alone, always reading, always watching. Whispers followed her quickly. Some students thought she was sent by the district to replace Fletcher permanently. Others said she had been hired as a political stunt to clean up the school's image. But Jaylen noticed the way she studied everything, down to how certain teachers addressed certain students, how seating charts shifted black kids to the back, how policies were enforced inconsistently, and how silence was weaponized just as much as words. On her 4th day, Miss Prescott handed Jaylen a book without saying anything. It was tucked beneath a small stack of papers, almost hidden, like something forbidden. He opened it when he got home. Invisible scholars, black mathematicians who changed history. Inside was a sticky note. Her handwriting was neat, but pressed deep into the paper, like she didn't just want to write, but to carve her message in. You are not an exception. You are a legacy. Jaylen read the entire book in one sitting. Names he had never heard before. Euphemia Haynes, David Blackwell, Dorothy Vaughan, brilliant minds erased from the chapters of his textbooks. People who looked like him, thought like him, fought like him. Their stories hit harder than the calculus textbooks ever could. He returned the book the next morning, but Miss Prescott simply slid another across his desk. This one, Notes from the Silence, Resistance in American Classrooms. She never made a scene, never praised him in front of others. But her eyes told him everything. She saw him. Not just his pain, not just his intelligence, but the intersection of both, the burden and the brilliance. What Jaylen didn't know was that Ms. Prescott wasn't here by accident. Years ago, she had left the classroom for good. After earning a law degree focused on educational equity, she'd spent time consulting on civil rights cases in New Jersey, Baltimore, and Atlanta. But when she saw the viral clip of Jaylen on social media, the mocking laughter, the phrase janitor math, the forced smile on the boy's face, something inside her cracked open again. Crestfall had always been a quiet town. But its quietness wasn't innocence. It was protection of systems, not students. She'd seen it before. Schools that punished black brilliance with suspicion, that twisted confidence into defiance, that called survival disruption. But this time, the story wasn't just a pattern. It was a face, and it reminded her of her own brother, who had been expelled for talking back to a teacher who questioned his reading level, then arrested a year later outside a 7-Eleven for loitering. He never made it to college, never got another chance. So Ms. Prescott requested a position at Crestfall, not because she believed it could be saved, but because she believed Jaylen still could. When she reviewed his school file, she noticed the inconsistencies immediately. Notes from teachers describing him as withdrawn and combative, but with perfect grades and advanced test scores. A pattern of subtle discipline, detentions for things like eye-rolling, and no formal complaints on his part, just silence. She also noticed something else. A deleted referral entry in the school's discipline system. A report filed by a teacher, a substitute months ago, referencing a classroom incident involving Mr. Fletcher and Jaylen. It had been marked resolved, but had no follow-up. The file showed it had been edited by the vice principal. It was a breadcrumb, and Miss Prescott had learned long ago. The cover-up always started small. A week later, she submitted an internal complaint to the district. It wasn't just about Mr. Fletcher's conduct. It was about the culture of fear, of coded language, of unequal enforcement. She cited examples from classroom seating, grading patterns, and the graffiti left on Jaylen's locker. She attached photos and timestamps. She referenced federal Title VI protections, and then she waited. 2 days passed. No response. Then on the district portal, the complaint vanished. Not denied, not under review. Simply gone, like it had never existed. When she contacted the district office, they claimed no record of any submission under her login credentials. She submitted a second copy. This time she printed it, hand-delivered it, and took a photograph of the secretary accepting it. The next morning, her school email was disabled due to a technical error. Jaylen saw the difference immediately. She was still composed, still sharp, but colder now, more deliberate, like someone walking with a shield. She stopped leaving books, stopped making eye contact with other staff. But when she passed Jaylen's desk, she tapped twice, quietly, the rhythm of resistance. He understood. The walls were watching. That afternoon, Jaylen opened his locker and found a new book placed carefully inside. Lies my teacher told me. No notes time, just the truth. That night, Maurice asked again how school was. Jaylen hesitated, but said something real. She's trying to help me, he said softly, but now they're going after her. Maurice didn't respond at first. He just stared at the kitchen window, watching nothing. He knew too well how systems protected themselves. Jaylen was vulnerable, but Ms. Prescott was a threat, and threats didn't survive long in towns like Barton Hollow. But Jaylen wasn't the only one watching her. That week, a group of parents filed an informal concern against Ms. Prescott for politicizing history. One said she made their child feel uncomfortable about being white. Another claimed she encouraged students to question authority too much. The principal called her in for a routine meeting to clarify boundaries. No mention of the missing complaint. No questions about the incident with Mr. Fletcher. Just veiled warnings. Ms. Prescott left the meeting without flinching. But when she returned to class that afternoon, something was different. She walked to the board, picked up the marker, and for the first time her hand trembled slightly. Jaylen noticed. And it broke something in him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was war. Prescott filed an internal complaint, and it mysteriously vanished. The school auditorium buzzed with artificial calm. Folding chairs clattered into neat rows, microphones were tested, and PTA volunteers handed out bottled water like they were preparing for a concert instead of a confrontation. But everyone knew this wasn't an ordinary meeting. Word had spread fast. Miss Prescott's mysterious complaint. The video of Jaylen, the graffiti, the threats, the silence. The undercurrent had swelled into a tidal wave. And now the people of Barton Hollow had gathered not to solve a problem, but to fight over who got to define it. Jaylen sat near the back, next to Maurice, both of them noticeably underdressed in a room filled with pearl earrings, pastel blouses, and pressed khakis. Miss Prescott stood quietly at the edge of the stage, arms folded, eyes fixed forward. Her presence alone was enough to keep some teachers nervously glancing toward the exits. At exactly 6:30 p.m., the PTA president, a woman named Victoria Granger, whose son had once loudly called Jaylen trash math in the cafeteria, tapped the microphone with performative concern. "We're here tonight to engage in civil discussion," she began, her smile practiced. "This community has always valued respect, integrity, and academic excellence. Let's remember that. But the moment the floor opened for comments, the mask dropped. A mother from the west side of town stood and spoke first, trembling but loud. Mr. Fletcher humiliated a student on video. It's not a misunderstanding, it's a pattern. How many other students has he silenced? Scattered applause. Before it died down, a tall man in a plaid sports coat jumped in. You're twisting the narrative. Mr. Fletcher is a professional. This boy, Jaylen, is just making trouble. Since when is calling on a student racism? Jaylen felt the heat spread across his skin. They weren't even pretending anymore. One parent leaned into the microphone and said the word race baiting 3 times in one sentence. Another called the viral video edited for effect. Several spoke about reputation damage to the school. Not a single one mentioned the slur spray painted on Jaylen's locker. Prescott remained stone-faced throughout. Then Maurice stood. He wasn't a man of speeches. His job, his life, had taught him to stay invisible. But watching this room contort his son's truth into something dirty, something dangerous, unlocked a fire he hadn't shown in years. He cleared his throat once, then leaned forward to the mic. I've been working in this school for over a decade. I've seen what gets ignored. I've seen what gets punished. And I've seen how my son gets treated for daring to be smart, while black. A few gasps. A few shifts in seats. He's not playing victim. He's surviving a system that labels him before he speaks. You all talk about standards, about excellence. But when my son shows it, you shame him for it. The room turned still, all except for one woman. Seated in the front row, she stood quickly and shouted over him. Why don't you stick to cleaning floors? A gasp rolled through the auditorium, like a ripple in glass. It wasn't the volume, it was the clarity, the smug confidence in her voice, the dismissiveness wrapped in venom. It cut through every mask in the room. Cameras recorded, the microphone still hot, caught every syllable. Jaylen didn't move. He stared straight ahead, his face locked, chest rising slowly. But something inside him fractured, not from the insult, but from the quiet that followed. The lack of outrage, the slow, timid glances from the very people who had smiled at him in passing weeks ago. The silence spoke louder than the slur. Miss Prescott finally moved. She stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and placed her hand on Maurice's shoulder, not to stop him, but to steady him. He nodded once, then sat back down. By the next morning, the clip had gone viral. Again, but this time, the story was no longer just Jaylen's humiliation. It was a father, silenced in public, told to know his place. The headline on the local news station read, "Janitor interrupted while defending son at heated PTA meeting." The screenshot told the story better than any article could. Maurice mid-sentence, eyes stern, while a white woman behind him sneered into a microphone. National outlets picked it up. Crestfall divided began trending. Talk show hosts debated the incident, using Jaylen's face as a symbol of a larger cultural war. Black parents across the country began sharing similar stories, of meetings where their voices were cut off, of sons and daughters who were punished for being exceptional. Inside the school, the atmosphere shifted again. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was tension. Some teachers walked on eggshells, afraid to speak. Others whispered that Jaylen had invited too much attention. A few even began documenting every minor disruption in class. Subtle retaliation disguised as policy. Jaylen noticed his math homework, began returning with vague feedback. Needs clarity. Check assumptions. No red marks. No specific corrections. Just doubt. Then came the unexpected twist. On a Tuesday afternoon, an emergency email was sent to all faculty. Effective immediately, Mr. Fletcher has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Some staff sighed in relief. Others rolled their eyes. But in room 208, the air felt different. Lighter. For a moment, Jaylen sat alone at his desk as the substitute took roll. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply exhaled, deep, slow, as if releasing something he hadn't dared to let go. But Miss Prescott knew better. She'd seen this before. Leave wasn't accountability. It was strategy. The school board would wait for the heat to die down. They'd let the media move on. Then, quietly, they'd decide if Fletcher returned through a back door, reassigned, or quietly retired. Because systems don't collapse in the face of truth. They absorb it, then reshape themselves. Jaylen wasn't celebrating. Neither was Maurice. Outside, the tension continued to mount. Parents began organizing behind the scenes. A Support Our Teachers rally was announced, coded language for defending Fletcher. Flyers were posted in coffee shops. Donations poured into anonymous GoFundMe pages. Inside the school, Jaylen began noticing subtle signs of exclusion. He wasn't invited to group projects. He found his desk moved twice. His name was left off the list of top academic performers in the school newsletter. Small things, but sharp. Then, one morning, he opened his locker and found it empty. Books gone. Folders missing. His calculator, the one his mother had saved up to buy him 3 years ago, was shattered at the bottom. No note this time. Just silence. The same silence that protected Fletcher. The same silence that dared him to break. Jaylen reported it. The school took a statement but promised nothing. Could be a prank, they said. Check lost and found. That night, Maurice didn't ask what was wrong. He just placed a new calculator on Jaylen's desk, along with a note from his mother's old journal. They will try to erase you. Let your brilliance stain every page. Jaylen didn't sleep that night, because deep down he knew something Fletcher had never said aloud, but had always acted upon. People like Jaylen weren't just supposed to fail. They were supposed to disappear quietly when they succeeded. And Fletcher, he wasn't done yet. Mr. Fletcher was placed on leave, but he wasn't done yet. Mr. Fletcher's departure didn't bring the relief Crestfall High expected. If anything, the air grew heavier. His empty desk in room 208 wasn't a victory. It was a warning. Jaylen felt it every time he walked past the door, every time teachers spoke softer around him, every time eyes lingered too long, searching for signs of guilt or arrogance. Because Fletcher might have been gone physically, but his influence had not left the building. In his quiet suburban home, blinds drawn, coffee mug half full, laptop open, Fletcher had already begun orchestrating his retaliation. Not loudly, not openly, but with measured precision. He wasn't angry because of what Jaylen had done. He was angry because Jaylen had exposed him. The humiliation of a viral video, the PTA backlash, the administrative leave, these were stains on a career he believed untouchable. So he shifted the battleground. Emails went out first. They weren't sent to Crestfall High. They were sent to colleges, scholarship boards, STEM summer programs, anyone who valued academic integrity. The tone of the emails was polite, seemingly professional, masked as concern. He mentioned incident reports, academic inconsistencies, and ongoing integrity evaluations involving Jaylen Reed. He never explicitly claimed wrongdoing. He simply implied it, and the implication was enough. One by one, automated replies came back. Thank you for the information. Some, after a few days, sent follow-ups. We appreciate the update regarding the student's status. Fletcher leaned back in his chair, satisfied. His absence from the school meant nothing if he could poison the waters ahead of Jaylen. But he didn't stop there. He contacted several teachers privately, colleagues who had always admired his strict, traditional approach. They were the type who complained about undisciplined kids and changing standards. To them, Fletcher said he had grown concerned about Maurice, the janitor, taking home cleaning supplies. He framed it as a gentle observation, nothing accusatory on paper. But the Thor ignited quickly. Within days, teachers began locking closets more tightly, counting bleach bottles, whispering about dishonesty in the staff lounge. Maurice felt the shift immediately. No one confronted him. They simply stopped greeting him. Some refused to sign his maintenance reports. Others watched him with cold, studying eyes whenever he passed. A job that had always been invisible became suffocating. For Jaylen, the tension became unavoidable. Students didn't just post mocking memes anymore. They created accounts solely dedicated to humiliating him. Pages titled Crestfall's Custodian Kid, Janitor Math Fail, and Room 208 Lies began circulating anonymously. They posted distorted screenshots of Jaylen's exams, edited videos, even photos taken without his knowledge in the hallway. Rumors spread like wildfire that he had connections helping his grades, that he cheated on assignments, that teachers were overcompensating for the racial controversy. And the worst part? Many believed it. Jaylen tried to focus on his AP practice tests. He tried to drown out the noise by studying harder, staying up late, reviewing notes until the words blurred. But concentration became a luxury. His mind drifted constantly, like it was wading through fog. His body felt heavier every day. Even the sound of his own name became exhausting. At school, the isolation grew tighter around him. Students stopped sitting within 2 desks of his. Some avoided him in the cafeteria, not wanting to be seen near the controversial kid. Even the librarians gave him cautious looks. Miss Prescott noticed the change before anyone else. She saw how Jaylen's once determined posture had wilted, how his steps had slowed, how he lingered at the door before entering any room, as if scanning for danger. She called him aside after class one day, her expression unwavering but her eyes heavy with concern. She didn't have to say much. Her silence carried more understanding than most people's words ever could. She guided him through breathing techniques, gave him structured study plans, taught him small grounding exercises to calm the panic that lodged itself in his chest. And every day she reminded him that he wasn't imagining the cruelty around him, because so many adults had tried to make him feel exactly that. But the school board was another story. When Miss Prescott tried again to raise concerns about the harassment and academic sabotage, she was met with familiar phrases: insufficient evidence, unverified claims, no proof of malicious intent. The board skirted around responsibility, as though acknowledging the problem meant admitting their own failure. Jaylen felt trapped in a loop. Every complaint died before reaching ears that mattered. At home, Maurice tried to keep his composure for his son's sake, but he felt the walls closing in. The whispers at work weren't subtle anymore. He saw the way coworkers clutched their clipboards when he walked in, the way their conversations halted abruptly when he approached. A few custodians from the night shift stopped talking to him altogether. The worst moment came when a teacher accidentally left her classroom door open during after-school cleanup. Maurice heard his own name spoken in a hushed tone, followed by the phrase, "I always thought he looked shifty." The comment wasn't even about Jaylen. It was about him. That night, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at his hands. The same hands that had scrubbed floors for years, repaired broken chairs, unclogged sinks, polished trophy cases, cleaned up messes others never acknowledged. Those hands had fed his family, clothed his son, given Jaylen a chance. But suddenly, in Barton Hollow's eyes, they were suspicious, and that was something he couldn't scrub away. The turning point came when Jaylen received an email from a scholarship program he had applied to months earlier. The subject line was neutral, but the content was devastating. "Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, we are unable to move forward due to concerns regarding academic integrity." No specifics, no explanation, just rejection based on a lie that hadn't even been voiced openly in his presence. Jaylen stared at the screen until the words lost meaning. Then he shut his laptop and walked outside, standing in the yard, as if the air itself could hold him together. His breath shook visibly. For the first time, he felt something worse than anger or fear. He felt small. When he came back inside, Miss Prescott called. Maurice overheard pieces of the conversation. Her voice contained urgency, something deeper than concern. She believed this wouldn't stop until someone intervened legally. She told Jaylen that documenting every incident was now necessary, that having witnesses mattered, that silence was no longer protection, it was permission. But the Reeds didn't have a lawyer. They didn't have resources. They didn't have connections. They had each other, and that felt dangerously insufficient against a system designed to swallow people like them whole. The next morning, Jaylen walked into school, feeling the weight of everything pressing down. He went straight to first period, trying to lose himself in routine. When the bell rang for second period, he entered room 28 early, hoping the quiet would steady him. But something was off. Students were whispering more intensely than usual. Their glances were sharper, directed at him with a new kind of judgment. Even the substitute teacher seemed uneasy. Jaylen sat down slowly. Then he noticed the packet of papers on his desk. His name was written on the top, underlined twice. Confusion flickered behind his eyes. He opened it. It was an official notice from the school administration. The words were clinical, unemotional, devastating. Notice of academic integrity violation. You are under investigation for cheating on the upcoming state math assessment. Jaylen froze. He hadn't even taken the exam yet. And still, he was already convicted. Jaylen was accused of cheating on a math exam he hadn't even taken yet. The envelope containing Jaylen's academic violation notice sat unopened on the kitchen table, though he already knew what it said. He had read the school's copy 3 times in class, each word digging deeper into the skin of his confidence. Official language made it sound like policy, but it felt like punishment wrapped in politeness. Maurice sat across from him, staring at it. His fingers flexed and stilled, over and over. The house was quiet, but tension screamed through the walls. The school had launched a formal investigation within 24 hours. No prior meeting, no questions asked, no chance for explanation. The email came from the vice principal's office, stating that Jaylen would be suspended from campus during the course of an academic integrity review. Suspended. Before the exam had even been administered, Jaylen didn't protest. He didn't know how. He had become numb to disbelief. Even logic had abandoned him. He wasn't being held accountable for an action. He was being erased for being unarrestable. At school, his desk in room 208 sat empty. Students who asked why he was gone received one-line replies. He's being evaluated. No details. No context. Just enough ambiguity to stain his name without the hassle of proving guilt. Maurice went to the school the next day. He wore his cleanest work shirt, tucked in tight. He stood outside the administrative offices for nearly 45 minutes before the principal agreed to see him. The conversation was short. Maurice tried to remain calm. He asked about the investigation. He asked for the basis of the accusation. He asked if anyone had reviewed his son's prior academic record. Years of consistent excellence, competition wins, near-perfect test scores. But the principal's face remained still, unmoved. "This is bigger than you," he finally said, leaning back in his chair. "Let the process play out." Maurice left that room hollow. Not just as a father, but as a man who had believed, perhaps foolishly, that hard work had built a safety net beneath his son. Meanwhile, Jaylen sat in his room, blinds drawn, backpack untouched. Each passing day felt like time stolen. He watched news segments about his own case like he was watching a stranger's downfall. On one channel, a panel of educators debated whether academic pressure had led him to cheat. On another, a talking head described him as bright but volatile. They used his photo from the viral video, the one where his eyes were half blinked, mouth tight, posture caught mid-recoil. A story was being built around him, one he wasn't writing. The school board released a short statement. Crestfall High is committed to academic integrity. While we do not comment on individual cases, we take all reports seriously and follow due process. But there was no process, only disappearance. Two of Jaylen's classmates, both from his AP Calculus study group, went to the assistant principal to defend him. They tried explaining how Jaylen had taught them concepts weeks before the assessment, how he had solved harder problems than the exam ever asked. They even showed screenshots of their text threads, study notes, shared practice tests. The school thanked them politely. The next day, both students were removed from their AP class. Their parents were called about disciplinary concerns. No connection to Jaylen was cited. But the message was clear. Ms. Prescott, though still teaching, found herself locked out of certain staff resources. Her weekly reports, previously part of a shared folder with the department head, suddenly went unanswered. The administration ignored her meeting requests. Her emails received brief, formulaic replies. So she stopped going through channels. Instead, she began digging. Using her limited staff credentials, she accessed archived schedules, old policy manuals, and past disciplinary cases. What she found was disturbing but unsurprising. Black students in advanced placement were more likely to be flagged for behavioral concerns. Their progress reports contained vague criticism, distracted, defensive, not collaborative. Meanwhile, white students with similar behavior received comments like assertive, confident, or independent thinker. It wasn't overt racism. It was the quiet, procedural kind. The kind written in spreadsheets and hidden in wording. Then she looked into the digital trail surrounding Jaylen's case. The official record said the trigger for the investigation was an anonymous tip received via the school's online reporting portal. No timestamp, no IP address, no follow-up. Conveniently vague. She cross-referenced the system logs, searching by keyword. Jaylen Reed. Test misconduct. Academic violation. Nothing appeared in the portal prior to the day Fletcher was placed on leave. Then something caught her eye. An old internal email, buried beneath layers of admin-only access. It was marked draft, and hadn't been sent, likely left behind by accident. The subject line read, Jaylen Reed, concerns regarding academic credibility. The body of the email was chilling. It outlined a strategy to preemptively manage reputational fallout by initiating a review into Jaylen's academic performance. It recommended using academic dishonesty as a neutral framework to discredit narratives that may emerge in the media. The Vice Principal Darren Lott. The email was dated 4 days before the cheating accusation was made public. Before the test was even distributed, Miss Prescott stared at the screen. Her heart pounded, not just with rage, but with realization. Jaylen wasn't being investigated for cheating. He was being eliminated for surviving humiliation. She copied the draft, saved the metadata, printed 2 hard copies, and emailed a third to herself. But she knew this wasn't enough. If the school wanted to cover its tracks, it would do so. If it had buried her complaint once, it could bury this too. She needed help from outside the system. She placed a call to a former colleague, now a journalist who specialized in educational equity cases. They agreed to meet that weekend, off record. She didn't give details, just coordinates and a time. That night, she slipped the envelope with the printed email beneath her mattress. At home, Jaylen was growing quieter by the hour. He had stopped checking emails, stopped opening messages from classmates, stopped responding to teachers who once called him inspiring. The walls of his room felt like a box now, one with no doors. He sat in front of his notebook, untouched, pencil resting beside it like a relic from another life. Maurice walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and didn't say a word. After a long silence, Jaylen finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They didn't beat me in class, so they rewrote the rules." Maurice swallowed hard, his throat tight. "They don't see you," he replied. "They see a threat, but that's only because you're something they can't explain." Jaylen didn't cry. Not anymore. He just nodded, once, as if filing that truth somewhere deeper. The following morning, the local news aired a breaking segment. A parent had leaked a copy of Jaylen's suspension letter. It didn't contain evidence, only vague references to internal observations and historical performance concerns. The public now saw what the Reeds already knew. There was no real case. But opinions didn't shift. They fractured. The town became a storm of speculation. Some blamed the school for overreacting. Others blamed Jaylen for bringing politics into academics. A few demanded Miss Prescott be fired for pushing an agenda. Rumors swirled that she was the one leaking documents to the press. Inside the school, the silence grew darker. And then, just as Miss Prescott feared, it happened. She logged into her staff account one afternoon, only to find it disabled. Her badge no longer worked at the entrance. Her class was reassigned to a long-term substitute. She wasn't fired. She was erased. Like Jaylen. Like truth. Miss Prescott found a hidden email on the school server, proof of a conspiracy. The silence following Miss Prescott's removal was deafening. Her absence echoed louder than any protest could. Students noticed immediately. Her name disappeared from the faculty list overnight. Her classroom door remained locked, its nameplate removed as if she had never existed. But Miss Prescott hadn't disappeared. She had gone underground. Operating now as an outsider gave her freedom the school walls never allowed. But it also meant danger. Alone in her apartment, with blinds drawn and laptop open, she retraced every step of the administration's campaign against Jaylen. Each policy memo, each digital log, each error that led to his academic exile. She knew the system was rigged. Now she needed undeniable proof. That's when she reached out to Andre Mays, a former IT staff member who had quietly resigned from Crestfall High a year earlier. Andre had always been brilliant, but underpaid, and when budget cuts came down, he was the first to go. But he had retained one thing the school didn't account for: archived admin access protocols and partial backups stored offline. Prescott met him at a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. No names were exchanged inside. No notes taken. Just a flash drive slid across the booth with a whisper. "Be careful. They scrub more than just files." Back in her apartment, Miss Prescott plugged in the drive, hands steady but heart pounding. Inside were logs, drafts, and internal memos most schools would never dare to save in writing. But this district, arrogant in its confidence, had become sloppy. The most damning file wasn't a report. It was a private email thread, hidden deep in a subdirectory titled Crisis MG. The thread was between Mr. Fletcher, the superintendent, and 2 unnamed board members. The subject: managing perception, Reed situation. The tone was cold, bureaucratic, strategic. They discussed not just Jaylen's academic record, but his optics. One line read, "We cannot allow this to become a case study in reverse discrimination." Another, "If we fail him quietly and offer a limited scholarship package, the narrative dies before it spreads." Prescott sat back in her chair, breath caught in her throat. This wasn't incompetence. This wasn't miscommunication. This was intentional. They had orchestrated a campaign to discredit a student, silence a father, and destroy a teacher, all to preserve power. And now, she had proof. The next step was clear. but dangerous. She called Olivia Tran, an investigative journalist she had met years ago during her time as an educational equity advocate. Olivia worked for a mid-level national outlet with a reputation for fearlessness and a growing online presence. They met the next day in a borrowed office in the city. Prescott handed over the flash drive. She didn't explain everything. She didn't need to. Olivia's eyes told her she understood. And when she said the words, "We'll go public within 72 hours," Prescott nodded, knowing her life would never return to what it was. 3 days later, the headline broke. Betrayed in the classroom. Internal emails reveal conspiracy to discredit black student at Crestfall High. The article included screenshots of the email chain, verified timestamps, blurred staff names for legal reasons. But Mr. Fletcher and the superintendent were named directly. Olivia's reporting was meticulous. The piece didn't just expose Crestfall. It placed it in the broader history of academic gatekeeping and racial sabotage. Social media erupted. Within hours, "Stand with Jaylen" trended across platforms. Activists began flooding the school's official pages. Public figures reposted the article. The local news station was forced to cover it after being called out for previously minimizing the situation. By nightfall, protest formed outside the school gates. Students stood with cardboard signs reading, "Truth isn't disruptive, silence is compliance, and we are watching." Alumni wrote open letters. Civil rights attorneys weighed in. The town's usual quiet was shattered. Jaylen watched it unfold from his window, still suspended, still locked out of his future. The attention brought no comfort. If anything, it sharpened the edges of his fear. Praise from strangers felt hollow, when hate lived just outside his front door. Because with attention came danger. It started with voicemails, garbled threats left on the family's landline. Then came the texts, untraceable numbers calling him a fraud, telling him to drop out or disappear. Then, Miss Prescott's car was vandalized. She found it the next morning, in her complex's parking lot. Tires slashed, windshield cracked. The word "liar" sprayed in red across the hood. The police took a report but offered no follow-up. She wasn't surprised. Back at Crestfall, the administration issued a rushed statement. "We take these allegations seriously, and have placed Superintendent Griggs and Mr. Fletcher under independent review." But no one believed the process would be fair. Not anymore. The school board scheduled a community hearing, hoping to diffuse tension, but every seat filled before the doors opened. Protesters stood outside with megaphones. Even teachers who once remained silent began speaking to reporters, off the record, afraid but finally cracking. Jaylen stayed home that night. He sat at the kitchen table, eyes on the TV as news anchors, discussed his life like it was a case file. He watched a clip of Miss Prescott walking confidently through cameras, refusing to shrink. He watched Maurice, just behind her, eyes steady. And then the unexpected happened. An envelope slid through their front door. No return address. No sender name. Just Jaylen's name. Handwritten in ink. Inside was a business card. "Aaron Voss, civil rights attorney." On the back, a handwritten note. "Pro bono. Discreet. Let's talk." Jaylen stared at it. Heart thudding. Maurice picked it up, reading it twice, then again. It felt too sudden, too perfect. But also, maybe finally, they hadn't contacted a lawyer. They hadn't asked for representation. Who was behind this, and why now? Jaylen flipped the card over again, and beneath the name, barely visible in the light, were 4 words, scribbled like a whisper. "You're not alone anymore." A mysterious donor offered Jaylen legal representation, but demanded secrecy. Jaylen had never stepped inside a courtroom before, not as a visitor, not even for jury duty with his father. But now he sat at the front table, his name printed in bold on a manila case folder, with reporters in the back row, and whispered conversations slithering through the gallery like snakes in tall grass. The courtroom was colder than expected, not from temperature, but from tension. It clung to the ceiling tiles, sank into the worn carpeting, settled into the slow, deliberate movement of the bailiff. The walls weren't just lined with legal decor, they were lined with history, and that history didn't belong to people like Jaylen. Beside him sat Aaron Voss, the mysterious attorney who had appeared with no invoice, no press release, and no past. He wore simple, dark suits, spoke only when necessary, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove his value to anyone. Jaylen asked him once why he was doing this, for free for someone he didn't know. Aaron had simply replied, "Because I've seen this play out too many times. and I'm tired of watching it end the same way. Across the aisle sat the district's legal team. 3 lawyers, all in tailored suits, flanked by a superintendent who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 2 weeks, and a representative from the state education board pretending not to glance at the cameras. The district's opening statement was as hollow as it was rehearsed. They painted Jaylen as a misunderstood but disruptive student. They cited unusual patterns in testing performance, escalating behavior concerns, and a series of internal decisions aligned with standard educational policy. Over and over, they repeated the same phrase, no racial intent. But they never explained the disappearing complaint. The falsified academic warnings, the lost exam footage, the missing test papers, the vandalism, the suspension issued before the test was even taken. Instead, they pointed to Fletcher's career awards, the superintendent's long-standing record of inclusive excellence, and generic policies printed in district manuals that hadn't been updated since the Bush administration. Then it was Jaylen's side. Aaron Voss didn't use theatrics. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He simply walked the court through a timeline, step by step from the classroom incident to the rigged investigation. Then he brought in the real voice of the story.
Miss Prescott.
She took the stand in a gray blouse, no makeup, and a face that had stopped softening for other people's comfort a long time ago. She didn't cry. She didn't perform. She spoke like a scalpel, precise, cutting, undeniable. She described the day she walked into Crestfall High. The silent racism that disguised itself as policy. The shifting desk assignments. The patterns in praise and punishment. The teachers who smiled in the hallway, but ignored black students' questions in class. And then she walked the courtroom through the conspiracy. The missing emails. The pre-written cheating narrative. The erased complaints. She held up a printed copy of the email labeled Managing Perception. And when she finished, she simply said, "This wasn't negligence. It was orchestration." The courtroom fell still. Then came Maurice. He sat stiffly in the witness chair, the same hands folded in his lap that had scrubbed those floors for over a decade. He didn't bring notes. He didn't need them. His story was written into the grout between Crestfall's tiles. He spoke about walking into the school, before sunrise, about being invisible in meetings, passed over in hallways, about the day someone slipped a note into his locker, calling him the help, about the night he found quit, scrawled in red paint, near the mop buckets. He spoke about watching his son shrink, not from failure, but from betrayal. And finally, his voice cracked when he said, "My boy never asked for special treatment. He just wanted a fair shot. But this town, it don't believe in fair shots for people like us." Jaylen watched from the table, fighting to stay composed. Every word his father spoke was a thread pulled from his spine, unraveling things he hadn't allowed himself to feel. The court took it all in. But truth, Jaylen had learned, wasn't enough. It had to survive scrutiny. The district cross-examined Ms. Prescott harshly. They implied she had fabricated the emails. They suggested her previous activism made her biased. They accused her of pushing her own agenda through a student's case. She didn't flinch. Maurice was treated even worse. A lawyer subtly questioned whether his emotional testimony was clouded by resentment. They implied that a janitor might misinterpret procedural actions and suggested Maurice's loyalty to his son made him unreliable. Jaylen gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. The judge remained expressionless. 3 days passed. Then came deliberation. It stretched into the weekend, then Monday, then Tuesday. The press speculated. Social media churned out theories. Anonymous commenters claimed Jaylen was a pawn. Others said he had brought the attention on himself. Jaylen tried not to read it. But some lines crawled through. Another race card pulled. This is why standards are slipping. If he's so smart, why can't he prove it the right way? Scholarship offers dried up one by one. Universities that had previously invited Jaylen to visit now sent quiet apologetic emails, thanking him for his interest, but citing unforeseen circumstances or internal review policies. No one said the word, but Jaylen knew it. It didn't matter if he won the case. His name had already been stained. Then came the verdict. Jaylen sat with Aaron on one side, Maurice on the other. The courtroom buzzed with breath held too long. The judge read slowly, deliberately. In the matter of Jaylen Reed versus Crestfall Unified School District, it is the decision of this court that the plaintiff, Jaylen Reed, was subject to a pattern of administrative misconduct, targeted policy manipulation, and discrimination masked by procedural language. A pause. This court rules in favor of the plaintiff. Gasps. Then silence. Then applause from the back of the courtroom. From students. From a few local activists. From Olivia Tran, the journalist, standing quietly near the wall with her notepad still in hand. Jaylen didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just sat there, breathing deeply, like someone who had finally come up for air after being held under too long. Aaron Voss placed a hand on his shoulder. Maurice exhaled a sound that was half sigh, half prayer. But it wasn't over, because as they stood to leave, a clerk rushed in with a sealed folder. He handed it to the district's lead counsel, who opened it quickly and whispered something into the superintendent's ear. Their faces hardened. Then came the announcement. The Crestfall Unified School District hereby files a formal appeal. The court ruled in Jaylen's favor, but the school immediately filed an appeal. The courtroom victory had barely settled before the headlines changed tone. One day, Jaylen was the face of resistance. The next, he was being reframed as a symbol of division, disruption, and wokeness gone too far. The ruling was public, but so was the appeal, and the appeal came with noise. TV anchors debated him with condescension wrapped in civility. Articles appeared questioning his maturity, his attitude, and whether race had really played a role. They dissected his facial expressions from court footage. They analyzed his tone in interview. They asked why he hadn't just moved on. But Jaylen couldn't move on. Because Barton Hollow wouldn't let him. He had been invited to speak at a televised education panel, sitting across from professors and policymakers who had never stepped foot inside a classroom like Room 208. Jaylen wore a navy suit jacket 2 sizes too big, borrowed from Aaron Voss. His voice shook slightly when he spoke, but his message was clear. Schools shouldn't punish black excellence to protect white egos. That single quote trended across Twitter, framed in bold white text. It became a rallying cry for some, and a provocation for others. Back in Barton Hollow, the temperature shifted fast. Parents began pulling their children out of Crestfall High, citing media distractions and safety concerns. Anonymous flyers appeared around town calling Jaylen a race baiter, an entitled fraud. A well-known local radio host went on air and called him an ungrateful troublemaker who turned a classroom into a courtroom. Jaylen stopped going to the grocery store with Maurice. He started wearing a hoodie in public. Not because he was cold, but because he needed the shield. A student from a neighboring school spat at him outside the library. The cops were called. Nothing came of it. Ms. Prescott remained in hiding, her address now listed under a different name. She published an op-ed in The Atlantic, titled When Schools Fail Truth, under a pseudonym. The article made rounds quietly. Lawyers reached out. Educators shared it. But inside Barton Hollow, her name was spoken only in whispers, if at all. The backlash wasn't limited to words. Maurice lost his job at the school district. The letter said budget cuts. But everyone knew better. His replacement was hired within a week, a younger white man with no janitorial experience. Maurice didn't protest. He simply came home one day, took off his uniform, and placed it in a bag as if he was burying something sacred. Jaylen sat with him in silence that night. There was nothing to say, only presence, only pain. Protests began to erupt, some in support, others in rage. Outside the school, people gathered with handmade signs. "We stand with Jaylen," signs clashed with "Save Our Schools from Politics" banners. One man held a poster reading, "Academic victim or activist pawn." Some students skipped class. Others returned wearing t-shirts mocking Jaylen's quotes, printed in sarcastic fonts. The administration did nothing. The principal issued a new dress code, claiming neutrality in political expression. It didn't apply to the teacher still wearing a back-the-board button on his blazer. Jaylen's teachers treated him differently now, not cruelly, but cautiously, like he was radioactive. They graded his work faster. They didn't challenge his questions. They rarely made eye contact. The trust between him and the system had shattered. What remained were the pieces, sharp, scattered, and dangerous to touch. Jaylen's mental health wavered. He stopped checking emails. He slept during the day, and stayed up late scrolling news feeds, searching for his name like a ghost, looking for evidence of its own existence. He kept a folder of hate messages, not because he believed them, but because he needed to remember what he was fighting against. Aaron Voss remained steady, navigating the appeal with sharp logic and silent rage. But even he began to show wear. The fight was taking longer than expected. Donations slowed, media attention flickered, and Jaylen, now a national name, was still without a secure college path. Until one afternoon, an envelope arrived. Inside was a letter from a private math institute in Chicago. They offered Jaylen a full scholarship to attend their summer honors program, if he could make it to the city. It was the first door to open without being slammed in his face. Maurice read the letter twice, then slid it back into the envelope like it might vanish if they celebrated too quickly. Jaylen accepted, quietly, without telling anyone else. But just before he could leave Barton Hollow for good, the town pulled him back in. A leak. Someone released an audio recording to the press. A deep, grainy voice. Mr. Fletcher. The file was time-stamped 2 weeks after he was placed on leave. In it, he was speaking on a call with what sounded like a school board member. His tone was bitter, vengeful, exposed. "I'm not the problem," he said. "You know what happened. You all know. We let it go too far. The second that Janitor's son got on TV, this town was done. You think this kid's special? He played the race card. That's all. And if you want me back, I'll come back. But we do it on my terms. No apologies. No optics. I'll expose what really happened if I don't get reinstated." The leak spread like wildfire. Mr. Fletcher's threat caught on tape. Teacher admits targeting student in audio bombshell. Crestfall cover-up. Who protected Fletcher? The town erupted again. Only this time, the smoke reached places it hadn't before. People who had stayed silent for months began speaking up. Students who once mocked Jaylen now posted support online. Some out of guilt, others out of self-preservation. Teachers came forward with statements, denying knowledge, but now offering weak solidarity. The district scrambled. The school board canceled a scheduled press conference. The principal went on personal leave. The superintendent issued a statement that read more like a confession than a denial. "We are reviewing all prior personnel decisions and re-evaluating leadership at Crestfall High." Jaylen read it all with a flat expression. He didn't feel vindicated, just hollow. Because what the tape revealed wasn't shocking to him. It was confirmation of what he'd always known. The system had never been broken. It was built this way. A leaked audio recording revealed Mr. Fletcher's plan to return and expose what really happened. The voice on the recording was unmistakable. Sharp, deliberate, drenched in entitlement. Mr. Fletcher didn't stutter, didn't hedge. He wasn't speaking in anger. He was speaking in confidence. It wasn't about the damn math. It was about setting a tone. You let one janitor's kid think he's above the system, and pretty soon the whole school forgets who's in charge. I needed to remind them. The recording had only been online for 20 minutes before it detonated across the country. It spread through group chats, education blogs, national news cycles. By the hour, it had reached all corners of the internet. Retweets, breakdown videos, and think pieces. Crestfall was no longer a local headline. It was now a national case study. Jaylen sat at the kitchen table, as the audio played on repeat, in the background. He wasn't shocked. Not really. What shook him wasn't Fletcher's voice. It was the ease in it, the casual nature of the hatred, the sense of safety Fletcher had felt when saying those words. That's what haunted Jaylen. Maurice stood behind him, arms folded, jaw clenched. His silence carried more weight than any outburst could have. He had known that tone. He had heard that voice in many forms behind closed doors, under breath, tucked between performance reviews and policy lines. But this time it was recorded. Unfiltered. Undeniable. The school board announced an emergency meeting within the hour, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Pressure came from everywhere: local community members, civil rights groups, and national organizations demanding action. Protesters gathered outside the district office as the board met behind closed doors. Signs read, "No more silence, fire the bias, dismantle, don't defend." Inside the building, the mood was frantic. Board members who once defended Fletcher now panicked, watching their emails overflow with demands for accountability. The superintendent attempted damage control, claiming ignorance of the recording and distancing himself from Fletcher. But the emails Miss Prescott had leaked told a different story, and now journalists were connecting the dots in real time. By evening, the board released a terse statement. "Mr. Fletcher has submitted his resignation, effective immediately. The district condemns the language and behavior captured in the recording and is committed to restoring trust." It sounded like resolution, but Jaylen didn't feel resolved. He didn't celebrate. He didn't post. He didn't even smile. Because for him, the fight hadn't been about removing a single teacher. It was about exposing a system that still hadn't apologized. that still hadn't looked him in the eye. Maurice said it best that night, sitting on the front porch under a quiet sky. Resignation ain't redemption, he said, and silence ain't healing. Jaylen nodded slowly, his hands resting on his knees. The trauma didn't lift with the news. It lingered in corners, in headlines, in how people looked at him when he passed. Some with sympathy, others with contempt. Some unsure of what side they had stood on, until the wind changed. In the days that followed, news crews camped outside the school gates. National outlets interviewed former students. Opinion columns dissected Fletcher's old school values versus modern educational expectations. The same voices that once ignored the story now amplified it for clicks, for credibility, for content. But for Jaylen, the story had never been about content. It was about being seen as human, in a place that had treated him like a warning. The district scrambled to contain the fallout. They offered an independent review of school disciplinary policies. They appointed a new acting principal, who made public visits to classrooms and held listening sessions for students. But Jaylen knew it was all surface. A week after the recording leak, he returned to Crestfall for the first time since the ruling. He walked through the halls quietly, eyes forward. Some students nodded. A few offered soft smiles. Most just stared. The school had painted over the graffiti on his old locker. They'd even installed a new camera in the hallway. But none of it mattered. The memory was still fresh in the walls. Teachers didn't know how to speak to him anymore. Some overcompensated with cheerful greetings. Others said nothing, afraid of saying the wrong thing. Even the ones who had once doubted him now offered empty stares, caught between guilt and discomfort. Jaylen didn't want apologies. He wanted acknowledgement. Real human acknowledgement. But none came. Instead, he received a letter. A thick envelope slid across the front office counter one morning. The return address read, Whitmore Institute of Advanced Mathematics, Chicago Division. Inside was a formal scholarship offer, full tuition, housing, travel stipend. A personal note from the program director read, We followed your case closely. Your resilience reflects the kind of brilliance we believe in. Jaylen read the letter twice. Maurice read it 3 times. It was everything they had fought for, but it came with a cost. The program started in 4 weeks. It required Jaylen to relocate to Chicago, permanently, leave Barton Hollow, leave his father, leave the town that had tried to break him. It was a chance to start over, but it also meant walking away, without finishing what he started. That night, Jaylen sat in the living room, letter in hand, staring at the flickering TV screen. A news anchor replayed the Fletcher recording again, this time over muted footage of Crestfall High students protesting outside the gym. Maurice entered the room quietly, drying his hands on a towel. You gonna go? He asked, voice low. Jaylen didn't answer immediately. He looked at his father, the man who had stood with him through every attack, who had swept those same halls while being accused of theft, who had watched his son rise and crumble in the same building. I don't know if leaving means I'm escaping, or if staying means I'm still trapped. Jaylen finally said. Maurice nodded slowly. Sometimes survival ain't about staying or leaving, he replied. It's about choosing who you get to be when the dust settles. Jaylen looked down at the letter again. For the first time in months, the decision wasn't being made for him. It was his. And just as he folded the offer back into its envelope, his phone buzzed. A new email. No subject line. He opened it. Inside was an anonymous tip, a forwarded message from a school employee. Attached was a second recording. This one, taken months before. In it, a voice. Another administrators discussed removing Miss Prescott permanently and keeping the janitor's kid out of academic headlines. Jaylen froze. The message read only one line. You think the story's over. It's not. A prestigious math institute offered Jaylen a scholarship, but it required leaving town. Jaylen didn't sleep the night he received the second recording. He listened to it again and again, the administrator's voice grainy but clear. There was no ambiguity this time, no plausible deniability. The words were loaded with intentionality. We can't let Prescott turn this into a national issue. And if the janitor's son keeps making noise, we'll be a headline, not a school. Handle it quietly, whatever it takes. The message had been buried, forgotten. Until now. Jaylen didn't know who had sent it. The email was encrypted, routed through multiple proxy servers. But it was clear someone on the inside still believed in truth, or guilt, or revenge. He forwarded it to Aaron Voss without a word. Aaron called within minutes, his voice laced with urgency. The appeal was still active, and this recording could dismantle any remaining credibility the district had clung to. It might even prompt a federal civil rights investigation. But Jaylen had already made his choice. He was leaving, not because he was running, but because he was finally allowed to walk away on his own terms. The days leading up to his departure were quiet. Jaylen began packing at night, methodically folding his few belongings into a second-hand suitcase with a cracked handle. His room felt smaller with every drawer emptied. The posters he once hung to feel normal now looked childish, distant, souvenirs from a life before everything burned. Maurice helped him pack. His hands moved slower than usual, not from age but from the weight of watching his only son step out into a world that had tried to chew him up. He didn't speak much. When he handed Jaylen the worn leather Bible his late wife used to keep on the mantel, he simply said, "She would have been proud." Beyond proud, Jaylen nodded, gripping the book with reverence. They didn't need a long goodbye. Their love had been proven in silence, in shared pain, in the way Maurice stood between him and the world, when it mattered most. On the morning of his departure, Jaylen stood outside their small house, bags at his feet, eyes scanning the street that had once felt too narrow to breathe in. Miss Prescott arrived just before sunrise. She wore her signature black coat and carried a small box wrapped in brown paper. Her eyes shimmered, not from sadness, but from recognition. She knew what it meant to leave your battlefield behind, and she knew what it took to survive long enough to do it on your own terms. "I couldn't protect you the way I wanted to," she said softly, handing him the box. "But you never needed protection. You needed space, and now you have it." Inside the box was a framed photo, Jaylen and his mother, taken on his 5th birthday. Maurice had once told her the photo had been lost. Somehow, she had found it. Jaylen's throat tightened as he clutched it. "Thank you," he whispered, barely audible. She hugged him, tightly, fiercely, like a mother who knew this might be the last time. When she pulled away, she placed a single envelope in his pocket. "Don't open it until you're ready to remember why you left," she said. Then she turned and walked away without looking back. Maurice drove, the same route he had taken every day to work. Only this time, it wasn't to clean up after people. It was to send his son forward into a life that, despite everything, was still waiting for him. They passed familiar places, Crestfall High, now under federal review. The town square, where silent protests had turned into verbal warfare. The corner store, where whispers had once followed them, like shadows. At the edge of town, a line of protesters stood silently on either side of the road. Some held signs of support, "Thank you, Jaylen." Others held signs dripping with resentment, "Good riddance." Jaylen didn't look away. He met their eyes. He wasn't afraid anymore. The city was colder, but the welcome was warm. The Whitmore Institute stood tall against the skyline, glass windows and polished stone, a place built for brilliance. Jaylen stepped inside and immediately noticed the difference. No whispers, no stares, just expectation. It wasn't a sanctuary, it was a proving ground. He wasn't treated like a symbol here. He was treated like a mind, a sharp one. Professors asked his opinions, not his backstory. Peers introduced themselves without hesitation. For the first time in years, Jaylen felt weightless, but not empty. Because he carried everything with him. The pain, the anger, the dignity, the name. Nights were hardest. When the day's lectures ended, and the lights dimmed, and the silence returned, Jaylen would sit on the small balcony outside his dorm, looking up at the stars, and wondering if Barton Hollow was still saying his name. That's when he opened Ms. Prescott's envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Typed, plain, no header. It read, "The world will try to rewrite your story. Let them. You've already lived the truth. Now make sure no one forgets it." Below it, a note in her handwriting. "And when you're ready, come back and finish what they started." He didn't know what that meant. Not yet. But he would. Weeks passed. Classes moved quickly. Concepts clicked. Jaylen thrived in the challenge. For once, he wasn't chasing validation. He was building something. A future. A name unshackled from pity or pain. He started writing again. Not assignments, but reflections. Stories. Pages that unpacked everything the world had tried to bury inside him. He didn't know what he would do with them, but they helped him sleep. Then one afternoon as he left a lecture, his phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, but then a text followed. "Jaylen, my name is Ava Rains. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I've followed your story since the beginning. I believe the world only knows half of it. Let's fix that. Together. Attached was a link, a trailer, rough cut, grainy footage of Crestfall, clips of protests, a close-up of a classroom door with 2008 still printed on the glass. At the end, a single black screen with white text. Janitor's son, the story they tried to silence. Jaylen stood frozen on the sidewalk, the city noise around him blurring. He didn't know if he was ready, but maybe the world was. A documentary filmmaker reached out, wanting to tell the whole story. The documentary wasn't just made, it was felt. Released under the title Janitor's Son, the story they tried to silence. It premiered at a small independent film festival and quickly caught fire. The footage was raw, stitched together from courtroom reels, classroom shots, interview clips, and the viral video that had once humiliated Jaylen, but now framed him as a symbol of courage. The film didn't sanitize the pain. It didn't blur the slurs or dilute the humiliation. It showed everything, how a gifted black student had nearly been erased, not for what he lacked, but for what he dared to be in a system that didn't expect someone like him to excel. Jaylen watched the premiere alone in his dorm, headphones on, fists clenched. By the time the credits rolled, he knew it wasn't just a film. It was a call. He didn't agree to press interviews immediately. He let the noise settle. He wanted to know what came next. Not for his name, but for the ones like him still stuck in rooms like So when a community college in Milwaukee invited him to speak on a panel about racial equity in education, he said yes. Then another request came. Then another. Within weeks, Jaylen found himself on a plane to conferences, summits, and town halls across the country. His voice matured. His message sharpened. He didn't speak in anger. He spoke with intention. He told students that excellence wasn't armor, that brilliance didn't erase bias, that sometimes the most dangerous thing a young black student could do in America was succeed too loudly. Audiences listened. Professors quoted him. Activists invited him. Even lawmakers began paying attention. When he wasn't speaking, he wrote. His essays, published in major education journals and national media outlets, pulled no punches. He dissected school policies with the same precision he once used in calculus. He challenged test scores as a weaponized tool. He exposed how funding disparities followed racial lines. But he didn't just critique. He created. Jaylen launched a national mentorship program called Proof Beyond Prejudice, built to support black students pursuing STEM fields in high schools with low resources. The program offered tutoring, emotional support, advocacy training, and scholarships. It spread faster than expected, first in Chicago, then Detroit, Atlanta, New Orleans, and beyond. He hired former students, teachers, and volunteers, many of whom had once been like him, brilliant, unseen, and one bad moment away from collapse. Maurice watched it all unfold from a quiet distance. He had found part-time work at a local school, not as a janitor this time, but as a volunteer coordinator. His badge now read, Mentor. But to the kids in the hall, he was more than that. He was a presence. A story, living proof that dignity could survive the system. Sometimes he would sit in the back row when Jaylen spoke at city events. He never told Jaylen he was coming. But Jaylen always knew. He could feel it. Still, with every success, Jaylen never forgot. He remembered the feel of the marker ink bleeding on his locker. The sting of Mr. Fletcher's voice in a silent room. The humiliation of being laughed at while solving an equation he wasn't supposed to know. Even now, when he saw a janitor in a school hallway, he paused. Not out of pity, but out of reverence. He always said thank you. Always. Because that job had built his backbone. Because that uniform had once been a target. And now, it was part of his armor. He was 21 when the call came. A policy advisor from Washington, D.C., reached out. Congress was preparing a national education reform bill targeting racial disparities in academic discipline, funding gaps in urban districts, and discriminatory grading practices. And they wanted to name it after him. The Jaylen Reed Academic Equity Act. He didn't respond right away. He needed time. He needed to understand what it meant to have your name carved into history, especially when history had once tried to erase you. That night he called Maurice. I don't know if I deserve this, Jaylen said. His father paused on the line, then answered, You don't get to decide if you're ready. You only get to decide if you're willing. Jaylen stared out the window. Beyond the city lights, beyond the cameras and applause, was still that quiet hallway, Still that rusted locker. Still that boy who once stood frozen as an entire class laughed. He picked up his pen and signed the acceptance. A national education reform bill was proposed, and it was named after him. The autumn air in Barton Hollow was crisper than Jaylen remembered. The trees lining Crestfall High's parking lot had turned shades of amber and burnt red, shedding their leaves like old memories. The building looked the same from the outside, weathered bricks, faded paint, but the inside, he had been told, was different now. Jaylen Reed returned, not as a student, but as a guest. Not to be graded, but to be heard. He stood at the front of the auditorium, wearing a tailored navy blue suit. His signature now, his voice had matured, but his tone carried the same precision it once had in room 208, the very place where his life had unraveled and reshaped all at once. It had been nearly a decade since the scandal, the recordings, the resignation, the scholarship and the legislation. Time had moved forward, but the echoes of that year still lived in the corners of his memory. He had been invited back for Equity Week, an annual initiative birthed from the very ashes of his experience. The hall was full: students, teachers, parents, even some board members. Many of the faces were new, but a few weren't. He spotted Miss Voss in the back row, older but still sharp-eyed. Maurice sat beside him, head high. Jaylen took a breath and stepped forward. He didn't talk about the calculus problem, or the laughter, or the locker graffiti. He talked about systems. He talked about how systems are designed to survive scrutiny, how they adapt without changing, how they pretend to evolve while holding on to the same roots. He talked about the cost of being exceptional in places where expectations are low. And then he talked about room 2. The auditorium held its breath as he told the story. His story, but from the outside in. He painted it not with victimhood, but with vision. He described the fear of being alone, the pressure of being the only, and the strength it took to fight when even the ground beneath him felt borrowed. But he didn't end with pain. He ended with proof. If they could change room 208, he said, then there's no excuse for leaving other rooms behind. Applause thundered. Not just polite claps, but something deeper: recognition, relief. After the assembly, the principal, a black woman named Ms. Renee Caldwell, led Jaylen through the new wing of the school. She showed him the renovated classrooms, the resource center for marginalized students, and finally, room. It had been transformed. Where once there had been a whiteboard covered in sarcastic equations and a teacher's smug smile, now stood a modern space, lined with books, scientific models, and quotes from black mathematicians and inventors. At the front of the room, right above the smartboard, was a metal plaque. In honor of Jaylen Reed, intelligence has no uniform. Jaylen stared at it for a long time.
He didn't cry. He didn't smile.
He simply stood still, because there were no words for being both the memory and the monument. Students trickled in afterward, some curious, some shy. They asked questions about his foundation, his work, his life. Some even apologized, confessing they had once reposted memes, laughed at him, or believed the lies. Jaylen didn't hold grudges. He held truth. As he prepared to leave, one student, a quiet freshman with dark eyes and a hesitant gait, approached him. She looked no older than he had been the day it all started. She leaned in as the crowd thinned around them, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're starting to target me now." Jaylen froze. He looked her in the eye. She wasn't asking for pity. She was warning him. The system hadn't disappeared. It had just changed shape. As he stepped off stage, a student whispered, "They're starting to target me now." No one should be mocked for where they come from, or who their parents are. Jaylen's story isn't rare. It's just rarely told. If you believe every student deserves dignity, not humiliation, type yes. If you believe in justice, subscribe if this broke your heart.